Welcome. You're watching Eye on Harvard. I'm Ogan Gurel. We have a great show ahead of us, and thank you for being with us. The world being affected by Harvardians, and Harvardians and the world affecting Harvardians. And we've been seen on 6 continents, and had some great shows, and we have a great show today with 2 guests, one of whom is, can I say hedge fund manager, or
Sure,
on the hedge fund team?
That's fine.
So obviously a very important topic with our economic turmoil. Brendan Carroll, a graduate of the business school, and then our second guest today is a very close friend of mine, Dr. Alfredo Quinn Jonas, who was a graduate of the medical school, and talking about his interesting career going from Mexico all the way to Johns Hopkins. So we'll talk about that later, but first, welcome, Brendan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Let me just quickly introduce you just from a high level, and then we'll jump into the topic at hand, which is hedge funds and the world of small cap investing.
Sure.
So Brendan is a principal at Victory Park Capital, and previously he was a member of a major hedge fund here in Chicago. He's also been at William Blair and Robertson Stevens. And also, maybe we could talk a little bit briefly. You were on the staff of United States Senator Joseph Lieberman.
Yes, I was.
And we have polarization with McCain and obviously the 2 Democratic candidates. And somewhere in between there are the independents.
That's right. That's right.
So we'll talk about that. And then of note, as I mentioned, he's a graduate of the Harvard Business School in 2004.
That's correct.
And why don't we dive into the topic? First of all, tell us a little bit about how you got in from the whole hedge fund world in general.
No, sure. So after Harvard, I moved here to Chicago and was at William Blair in investment banking. Left and joined a large hedge fund here in town. And after a few years, my group within that fund, which focused on small cap, decided to venture out on our own and start our own fund, which we did last year.
That's great. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Always challenging, whether it's a mom and pop or a huge hedge fund, to start business during a recession.
Yes, but we're in a niche sector, and we think that the strategy we focus on in this environment is actually beneficial for us. So.
Yeah, we'll talk about that
Yes.
some more, but I think regardless of the sector, if you will, and obviously the investment opportunities that may arise out of this turmoil,
Yes,
generally they say
it's
that
an uphill fight.
it's an uphill fight. But even that being said, there's a phrase that if you start a business, or at least build new ideas, etc., during a recession, coming out of it puts you in a very good position.
I hope you're right. That's how we view it, and that's what we think, which is why we set out on our own anyway. So.
Sure. And anything in particular about your Harvard experience that either led you to or prepared you for, or however you want to phrase it, for the hedge fund world?
Sure. I mean, the experience I had there and the case study method obviously is one I was a big advocate of, but the people you get to meet and the leaders within both, the financial community, not just hedge funds, but mutual funds, endowments, investment funds, etc., that the school brings in on campus and brings into the classroom and allows you to interact with, just gives you a real life experience in it. So I think what's most beneficial is in getting in touch with those people. The Harvard network, I think, is second to none. So when I was leaving the investment banking world and switching over to the hedge fund side, I had no shortage of people that I could speak to, both that were friends of mine and classmates that had experience in the industry, but also other people here in Chicago and elsewhere that I just reached out to through the Harvard network, who are always pretty happy to speak to somebody else and give them advice and give them some bits of their knowledge on the industry. So I think that is second to none, and obviously, the rigor of the case study method also helps you in that area as well. But I think it's more of the hands-on experience you get from all the other, both students in your class as well as the alumni that you get access to postgraduate.
And that raises an interesting point. We're going to talk a little bit more later on about small cap investing, and you may want to certainly define that for our audience as we dive into it. But a lot of the cases at Harvard Business School, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not a graduate there. I did sit in on some classes as a sort of a guest, if you will. I would imagine they focus more on large cap, Fortune 500 cases, or is that a misperception?
Well, it's a mix. Depends which class you're in. I mean, aside from, I should have mentioned where else the Harvard experience helps is, aside from the fund's investment focus, there's also building a business. So securing office space, having the right legal forms in place, human resources, health insurance, payroll, all those sorts of things that until this time I never really had to think about. there's plenty of different case studies, whether it's an entrepreneurial management course, a marketing course, etc., that looks at different sorts of businesses. No, and it's not all large cap. I think Harvard looks at VC all the way through large cap. Yes, we do cases on Ford, but we also do cases.
And those tend to get published and sort of in the public eye. Exactly.
But we also do, there were also cases on a 2-person startup and how that got off the ground and how they fought during a recession or how they built their business over time, etc. So they're not just looking at the large cap perspective, at least while I was there.
Right. Well, that makes sense. And we're going to be approaching a break fairly soon, but maybe we could talk a little bit about this fascinating experience you had with Senator Lieberman.
Sure.
Especially given what's going on now.
When I went to Georgetown undergrad, and I was an intern for Senator Lieberman all 4 years there, and worked as his personal assistant, and I was his chauffeur for a while when I was an 18-year-old student at Georgetown, and
you learn about things before anyone else.
It was a great experience. I have nothing but the utmost respect for the man. I think he's one of the greatest leaders that I've ever encountered. Democrat, Republican, Independent, people label him all three. Even though he is technically an independent right now, I think the courage he's had to maintain his course in his views and positions, especially within the war of Iraq, while going against what many Democrats feel, he has not changed course. And while not everyone agrees with his position, they should at least admire and respect his courage and the fact that he has stayed the course.
And consistency, I guess, because
he's extremely consistent.
One complaint about a lot of political candidates, or some political candidates, is sometimes not so much their positions, but their consistency.
No, that's correct. And he is, I've known him since I was 17 years old, and I don't think he has changed a bit. He's always been the same person. He's a very respectful person no matter who he's speaking to. I don't care if it's the President of the United States or the 17-year-old intern. He treats that person with respect, and that goes a long way. So I have nothing but the utmost respect for him.
And now, you were with him when he was a Democrat. I mean, now clearly that
yes.
switch came later.
That switch came later. We supported him throughout. Obviously, I worked for him when he was a Democrat. I worked on his vice presidential campaign.
When I say with him, I meant working with him.
Yes, I worked with him on his vice presidential campaign. And then, actually, while I was at Harvard, it was during his presidential run. So on weekends, I would drive up to New Hampshire and help with him during the New Hampshire primary season. So once you're on the team, you never really get off. And then this last time, now I'm more involved with helping in the last election, raising money personally, but I hadn't worked for him in that area. But he lost the Democratic nomination to run for the Senate in Connecticut, but then ran as an independent and won, which I think was very vindicating for all of us Lieberman supporters who have been following him for a long, long time.
So here's an interesting question, and certainly you don't need to answer if there's any level of discomfort, but do you think he's going to be involved as a vice presidential candidate?
I mean, I would hope so, but I don't think so. Given the fact that he's an independent, I don't think the Republican Party would want to go that route, just as the way the Democratic Party wouldn't want to go that route. It wouldn't surprise me if McCain were to win that he would have some other position, because I think he's a statesman and a brilliant leader, and it would be every American's benefit to have him in that position. But I don't think he would be a vice presidential candidate.
Well, it sounds like he is Senator Lieberman's great benefit to have someone like you as a supporter, certainly.
Well, I hope so, but
we're going to go to a break. We're going to talk about hedge funds right afterwards. Stay right there. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Michael Momando. You're watching the In Time TV network, where professionals save big time connecting with their community worldwide. If you're in the restaurant or hospitality industry, I invite you to tune in to Restaurant Talk, where you can email or call in questions, comments, or concerns. You may even be a guest on our weekly Saturday show. To see a recent tasty episode of Restaurant Talk, please tune in to www.intimetv.com.
When someone abducts a child, they're not about to advertise it. But we will. Sign up at wirelessamber-alerts.org to get free Amber Alert text messages on your cell phone. Help put a child abductor out of business for good. Wireless Amber Alerts. A child is calling for help.
Welcome back. You're watching Eye on Harvard. I'm Ogan Gurel, your host. the world according to, or not according to, I should say, affected by Harvardians and Harvardians affecting the world, and to some extent according to, because it's a matter of interpretation. And we have with us a great guest, Brendan Carroll, graduate of the business school in '04. We talked about his experiences with Senator Joseph Lieberman, and now we're going to talk about hedge funds and their particular strategy. I know that there's certainly proprietary aspects,
Sure.
which you won't reveal, but he's a principal at Victory Park Capital, which focuses on small cap investing. Let's start out with a little bit of how you define small cap, and then we'll lead into your strategies.
Sure. Everyone has their own definitions. We view small cap as really the $750 million market cap and less. Some people say small cap is really $3 to $5 billion or up to $7 billion, but how we view it, and when I say small cap, I mean sub $750 million market cap public companies, and they could be traded on NASDAQ, Amex, Bulletin Board, etc.
And is there something magic about that number? That's a loaded question, but how do you come
really.
up with that number?
It's really more of how we view our universe and the number of companies where we think we can be competitive with, and where the amounts of capital that we like to deploy to a certain company based on that size, what percentage of the company that would make up, etc. So it's in more of a niche focus. So it's small, smaller dollars, focusing on smaller companies where we think there's potential greater upside and more inefficiency when it comes to information flow, etc.
Well, that leads to the next question. I mean, you kind of set that up, but clearly there's a quantitative difference in your definition and many others' definition, depending on the number between small cap and large cap. In your case, it's $750 million. Can you give us a sense, and some of us are not professional investors in the audience, certainly, what are the qualitative differences between, say, small cap and large cap?
Sure. Obviously, larger corporations, you're going to have bigger infrastructures. You're going to have, a lot of times the management teams may be more seasoned and more experienced. That's, I'm generalizing, but a lot of times, the CEO of a Ford or a GE obviously has much more experience in dealing with the public markets, in dealing with, the daily rigor and mortis of what the Wall Street analysts than, say, the CEO of that $100 million company that doesn't get the attention of Wall Street and analysts in the investment banking community. So, yes, from a qualitative perspective, I think there is a difference. Also, just in terms of daily disclosure, SEC requirements, etc. Bigger organizations are usually more organized than that, which is why you see for smaller companies, the SEC regulations and the disclosure requirements are sometimes not as restrictive. You saw with Sarbanes-Oxley, smaller companies were given more time to comply than the larger companies, largely because they don't have the resources. And we could talk about this at length, but just in terms of bringing on accounting firms, it's cost a lot of money to be compliant with Sarbanes-Oxley, and a lot of times the smaller companies, for them an extra few million dollars a year is a very, very big deal, and for that large cap national company, no, it's not. So I think from that perspective, there is a big difference.
And interestingly, this is a little bit of a side point. There had been discussion, and I think there still is discussion, although overshadowed by banking regulation and the economy in general, that Sarbanes-Oxley, particularly for small companies, was just too onerous.
I think that's probably right. They've done some things recently that maybe aren't Sarbanes-Oxley related for the small cap companies to help generate investors, whether it's they changed in the, I'm starting to get technical, but the rules of the 144 rules, which now dictate that a company's stock can be liquid after 6 months, and you don't have to wait necessarily the full year before a shareholder can go out and sell that stock. So that makes it more attractive to investors to invest in a small cap company, knowing that technically they have the ability to sell their stock in 6 months versus a year. So I think the SEC has done some things to help the smaller company, but I do agree with you. I think they were a little onerous.
And let's talk a little bit about the current economic situation. We'll be coming up on a break fairly shortly, and how that affects small caps and, in a sense, differentiates between large cap and small cap.
Sure. So I will generalize, but my expertise is more in small cap. And just how we view it is it's really on two ends. So the small cap company that's going out to look to raise capital right now is facing, I would say, a battle on both ends. On one side, the banks, which traditionally had lent a lot to that $250 million small cap company, whether it be a revolver or term loan, largely have backed away or aren't as aggressive in that business anymore because of what's going on in the credit markets, because they have other problems to deal with in their portfolios. And then on the equity side, on the other end, the mutual funds and the other equity-focused hedge funds that for the last 5 or 6 years dipped down and bought a lot in the small cap area have backed away to a certain extent because of, one, the stocks are down, and two, liquidity is dried up because there aren't as many buyers of those positions. So all of a sudden the small cap company has a tough time getting a credit facility in place with the banks on one side, and on the other side, even if they want to raise an equity deal, and at this case a lot of CEOs don't want to because they think the stock is too cheap at this level, they can't get the buyers anyway, so they're facing a real crunch if they want to take advantage of making an acquisition or having a new growth initiative. So it becomes more of a supply-demand inefficiency, and those that focus on the market really have the pricing power right now. And I think that is, that's a big difference.
The buyers of these.
The buyers of these, yes. They have. We saw this a little bit, I would say, post the internet collapse and back in 2001, 2002, whereas, stock valuations came way off and all of a sudden liquidity started to dry up a little bit and the investor had the power again. But at that point, the banks, for the most part, were still aggressive in lending to the small cap company. This time around, that does not seem to be the case.
There's a double whammy, as you
Yes, you have
indicate.
the banks on one side and the lack of equity infusion on the other, which is really creating a void for these companies. And there's which I think creates great inefficiency, and there's potential value opportunities out there where a company that's healthy, but just doesn't have the ability to attract capital. And if people are willing to focus in that area, I think it can be very attractive. Now, you have to have the willingness to wait it out because who knows how long this credit dislocation will last. Mm-hmm. But because of that, it does create a nice sort of pocket for potential upside for that investment career.
And it would seem that the opportunity exists mainly because this is very different than 2001. And if I might just clarify.
So with 2001, the market fall off, and that fall off was a lot bigger, by the way, than what we've seen thus far. So the market fall off then was largely because people thought stocks were overvalued.
The fundamentals of the companies were in question.
Exactly. And there were hyped valuations, trading on revenue. You can speculate as to whether or not those were real businesses or not.
Yeah, right.
But that was the joke back then. Those fell off. But it didn't have to do with the banks. It wasn't the write-down in mortgages. It wasn't a credit issue. This time around, the stocks are way off because the banks are having issues.
Or to put it more broadly, the macroeconomics is having issues.
Correct.
And the fundamentals are, we're not talking about companies that are...
no, we're talking about over macro levels as a whole, which affect companies, but that's the main.
We'll talk about this right after the break. Eye on Harvard, stay right there. We'll be right back.
No matter where you live, life in the oceans depends on you. To keep our oceans clean, recycle and dispose of trash properly. To learn what you can do, go to keepoceansclean.org.
Once they've outgrown their toddler seat, they're still not ready for adult safety belts alone. 4'9" is the magic number. Until then, kids need a booster seat. Make sure your little pumpkin gets there safely. Visit boosterseat.gov.
Welcome back. You're watching Eye on Harvard. Our guest for this first half hour is Brendan Carroll, a principal at Victory Park Capital. We were talking just before the break about the opportunities in small cap investing, the contrast with 2001, the intersection, if you will, of macroeconomics and the business fundamentals, and the premise, again, a generalization that the business fundamentals are not off, but that the macroeconomics are creating, what, as you phrased it, a buyer's market.
Supply, demand, inefficiency in favor of the buyer.
Favor of the buyer. Now, there are other aspects to this that I'd like to explore with you. One of them is the weaker dollar, for example.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about how that is affecting the equation.
So, it goes back to how we talked about a lot of those equity-focused funds have backed away from the small-cap company. And one reason that we see is because they're looking for investments in larger-cap companies that have more of a multinational, international presence. Obviously, the weak dollar helps for the revenue actually, reported here in the U.S., but
like Boeing's profits were up
exactly,
and all that. Yeah.
Exactly. But global growth is a lot of what we see investors looking for, which is why they're going more upmarket. And the sub $750 million area doesn't have much. Some of the companies have global presence, but a lot of them are not. They're U.S. focused companies, or they have more of a niche focus, and it doesn't have that international presence, so they don't get to take advantage of that weak dollar in having revenue generated overseas.
Right. And so for that liquidity that's out there, it's going towards the large caps in anticipation of increased revenue from the exports. In fact, what I think happened in the stock market the last couple of days, that there was some stabilization, if you will, because people felt that that would help save some companies.
No, I think that's true. And then I think another good point, at least within small cap, is obviously there's been a big trend with all the big banks. You see a lot of the sovereign investment funds making large investments in U.S. companies.
So Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi, all that.
Kuwait, etc. Where I don't think you're going to see the sovereign funds investing directly is within the small cap realm. One, because it's not a large enough market for them. Obviously, they move in bigger dollars and are buying bigger stakes of larger companies. It's not a big enough market for them to put capital to work, and the lack of information and the inefficiency makes it hard, I think, for a large foreign investor to come in and try to take over and buy up that market. So that's why we don't think we see a lot of foreign investment coming into that small cap world, which leaves it to be in domestic hands, which is why, again, you're not seeing much liquidity in that area, because that global liquidity you're seeing in other areas is not dipping down. Small cap is usually the last to get hit and the last to recover, but it's not going to have the benefits, I think, of that global liquidity from the sovereigns that you're seeing going into the large cap space.
So this begs the question, Brandon. Sounds like there's a lot going against small caps, and you have to be a brave soul to enter that.
I think that's right. I think
so.
Well,
you know where I'm leading.
We focus on credit, so it has to. Do you like the value? Do you think a company has a good asset base, and do you think there's growth potential for the future? You have to be a long-term investor, and I'm not saying that the bottom is even here yet, but there are good companies out there, and because you have the lack of supply in terms of people wanting to put capital in that space, you have a little more pricing power, so to say, if you're looking to invest directly. If you look over the last 6 years, $5 billion per quarter gets invested directly in sub $750 million companies. This isn't open market trading. This is a direct private placement of equity, debt, convertible debt, etc. That hasn't changed. That's remained consistent. All that changes is who is supplying that paper and who gets the structuring power on that side. It's now, small cap moves in cycles. I like to say it trades on fear and greed. Right now, you're in a fear cycle, so that gives the investor power. So again, companies still need money. $5 billion a quarter is still going to go in, but in these times, and I can only speculate as to how long it's going to last, 18 months, 2 years, etc., there's going to be advantageous pricing power for someone that has the appetite and the risk exposure to go into a small cap company. It's not something someone should be focused on solely. Obviously, buying the world, I think, is always the safest bet in managing a portfolio, but there is great opportunity there, and now I think you have the ability to set the structure. So if you're more senior in the capital structure, or so to say, where you're secured by an asset as opposed to just buying small cap equity, that you don't always have that ability. Right now, I think you do, and that's why we think it's attractive.
It's interesting. I mean, there's always a flip side to things. I mean, one can say you don't have the transparency, the volumes of Wall Street reports and information. And the reason I say there's a flip side and a positive side to this is that those volumes of reports, whether they be credit ratings on bundles of subprime mortgages, there can be systematic error with those. So it's a lot of information, but if it's all wrong, it doesn't help you.
It's good and bad. It's bad in that you don't have that information readily available. You don't have, a lot of these companies don't have research analysts writing reports on it. A lot of the credit for these companies don't have an S&P or a Moody's rating.
But to the extent that information may be wrong, you're not going to be set off track.
That's correct. There's a great inefficiency, which I think is the most inefficient market. If you're willing to do the work and go down and find it, then I think there are great potential investment ideas that lie there. But again, it's not something where someone should be focused solely. But that's our view, and that's how we focus our fund.
And it sounds like, to some extent, so I appreciate your time with us. It's a lot of work.
It is. It's back to your question before about qualitative and quantitative. It takes a lot of work. A lot of times there isn't the infrastructure in place to get you the information you need, so you have to roll your sleeves up a little bit more to dig in, and it takes a lot more time, and the information isn't always there. But on the flip side, usually you get access to management, whereas the normal investor can't always get access to the CEO of a global multinational company. In this case, typically, as a significant investor in that company, you're going to have the access to get the information.
Especially as you put it, it's a buyer's market. They kind of have to listen to if funds are dry.
And a lot of those CEOs are aggressive because they want to make acquisitions and take advantage of somebody else to press stock price right now. And they're willing to pay a little bit of a higher interest rate or give a little more terms that are more beneficial to the investor right now because it allows them to take advantage of it, because they know if they issue equity at these levels, it's far more dilutive, and they think their stock will go up over the next few years, and they'd rather issue equity later. So how can we get some capital in now to try to take advantage of the downturn?
And just at a very high level, we're approaching the very end of our time. What's your perspective on the economy? You said implied it's not over yet.
I mean, it's one personal opinion, but I do not think it's over yet. I just think if you look back to how the stock market fell off after the internet collapse, we're not even close to that level at these situations. And I still don't think you've seen the small banks come out yet with what they have on their balance sheets. You're seeing the large banks. So I think we've got a ways to go. But for someone focused in my area, that's a positive thing.
Sounds good. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Brandon, for your insights. And thanks again.
Thanks for coming.
We'll be right back with Dr. Alfredo Quinn Jonas. Stay right there.
Today, we're moving faster than ever before. Even your ideal prospect will see your ad, click to your website, then decide to read on or read none in a mere 1 to 7 seconds. After that, you become invisible. So what's the answer? How do you capture and hold the attention of your target audience? In Time TV. The In Time TV network broadcasts industry-specific TV shows to the people who buy your products: surgeons, primary care physicians, dentists, podiatrists, chiropractors, hospital administrators can now watch live in-time programs on widescreen, on their PC or laptop while checking email. Shows can even be viewed on a cell phone during a train commute. In Time TV is peer-to-peer TV that covers the hot topics in industries that you sell to. In Time TV shows are broadcast worldwide via the internet, yet the cost of running a 60-second commercial is a fraction of what you'd pay for a display ad in a trade magazine. In Time TV is what your target audience is watching.
Keeping professionals engaged worldwide.
Mom?
Dad?
How long should I wait for you?
If I'm at soccer practice.
What if something happens? Will you come get me?
There's no reason not to have a plan in case of an emergency.
Should we go to the neighbor's house?
And some extremely good reasons why you should.
Can you tell me?
Talk to your family about what you would do in case of an emergency.
Welcome back. You're watching Eye on Harvard, brought to you by In Time TV. I'm your host, Ogan Gurel. Our guest, Dr. Alfredo Quinn Jonas, who's actually a good friend of mine, and it's great to see you, Alfredo, Dr. Quinn Jonas.
Thank you, Dr. Gurel.
And the last time we met, you were a medical student on service that I was a resident on.
That's correct.
The incredible story of your life continues.
Well, we've been very lucky, Ogan, as you know. At the time I was a medical student, I had a wonderful privilege of working with you under your guidance as you were a resident in neurosurgery as well. at the Massachusetts General Hospital.
Well, I knew you were up to great things, and I don't want to make other people feel jealous, but you're definitely, certainly one of the best medical students, but also one of my favorite.
Thank you. Thank you, again. You're very
Let me
kind.
introduce you formally. Dr. Quinn Jonas is a graduate of Harvard Medical School in 1998, and also a graduate of Berkeley, and you'll tell us a little bit about that progression. And he went to do his neurological surgery residency as well as fellowship at the University of California, San Francisco. And having been in that field, I know that that is certainly we think highly of the Harvard system, but UCSF is certainly one of the preeminent programs. And then he went on to another preeminent program where he's now associate professor of neurosurgery and oncology at Johns Hopkins. So the reason why it's an incredible career, some of you may have heard about as well. But Dr. Quinn Jonas has a very interesting history that I'll let him tell us. But he was previously actually, if I might even say, illegal immigrant.
That's
and
right.
you know, it's in the politics presently, and obviously there's a personal impact. So he was a migrant worker from Mexico, and I remember when we were together, he was telling me the stories. You'll hear it in person. And then, of course, went through a series of events. Ended up at Harvard Medical School, and then now professor of neurosurgery. So let's start out. Tell us a little bit from the beginning, your story. It was published in the New England Journal, and tell us to our interested audience.
Well, I was, as you know, and I grew up in very humble backgrounds in Mexico, in a small little town in the peninsula of Baja California, you know, south of the border.
Yeah.
And I was, despite of the fact that we didn't have much in the way of money, we had a wonderful family, and the unity of my family was absolutely incredible. My parents were really role models. They worked very hard, despite of a lot of things that the country was going through in the 1970s. So early on, I began to conceive the idea, probably, as I look back in my life right now, of one day coming up to the United States to find better ways. But many people have asked me, Ogan, why is it that you left your country? I always answer to that, it wasn't by choice, it was by necessity. I grew up very poor. We had very little. As a matter of fact, there were times where we didn't have any food on our table. We went through very harsh, critical times. The bifurcation of classes became more accentuated in the 70s and early 80s in Mexico.
There's a lot of political and economic turmoil.
It was unbelievable. And it's not like it's gotten a lot better, to be honest with you. If anything, it's continued. And I always tell people it was based on necessity. I just had a dream that I was going to be able to provide what my family needed, which is basically food on our tables. I mean,
Sure.
That was a dream that I had.
Well, if I might say, I mean, I do remember very clearly our discussions. We obviously talked clinical topics, we took care of patients, but we also talked about, our respective stories. We were good friends, and I remember very clearly what you said to me, or what I felt was what I interpreted. It's not so much you were leaving Mexico to go to Mexico, to the United States, but you were an extension of your family.
That's right.
You were the part of the family that could go.
That's correct. That's
and
correct.
in a sense, it was almost like we were coming to the United States, even though you physically were the one who was coming.
That's correct. Well, it was part of...
I thought that was fascinating.
It was part of one of those things where that's what we needed. That's what I needed to do at the time to provide for my parents and my siblings and for my extended family. And like I said before, many times we do things not based on desire but based on necessity. And this was a classic example in my life.
Necessity breeds invention, I think the phrase is. So tell us what sort of inventions you did to get and I don't mean it to get the food on the table.
Absolutely. I mean, I came to the United States, and many people, have asked me. Never forget, one day I was sitting at a table like this, first week in my class at Harvard Medical School, and I'm sitting at a table with my classmates, and one of them asked me where I was from, and I said, I am from Mexico. And then this person, I said, oh, when did you come to the United States? And I gave the time, in the mid-'80s. And I said, oh, and what does your family do? And I told them my family were, migrant farm workers. And they said, so how did you get to the United States? And then I said, I was eating, and I said, I hopped the fence. And everybody was laughing. And
but it was true.
But I kept eating. And I wasn't laughing. It was, and then everybody looked at me and they realized it was true.
Well, let's look at, we have a picture that I've taken, well, you took the picture, or your family took the picture with your mother.
That's right.
There's a little personal face to that.
Unbelievable.
Let's see that picture.
It's unbelievable. This is a
and
beautiful
I can recognize
picture.
You there.
You know, it's a beautiful picture. I always tell people, you know, see, my head was always as big. So that I show that picture just to show that at the time I already had this, you know, big head and probably a little bit of what we call hydrocephalus, this water accumulation in the brain. So you can see my mother was right there, about 20 years old.
That's a
very
beautiful
young.
picture.
And it's a wonderful, and I was a 1-year-old, and that's not a real cake. As you can see, my hand is on the cake and is not doing anything. So it's just an absolutely gorgeous picture of my mom.
And then the reason I wanted to show that picture is we also have a picture, the second one, which shows that fence that you hopped.
That's exactly right. If we can
Let's bring that
show
up.
that picture, you can see that is actually, you're looking from the United States side into the Mexican side, already from the United States, and that is exactly the place where I have the fence.
And it sounds like it was probably a few years later, because most people don't have the luxury of taking pictures when they're hopping.
Exactly. Oh, I always laugh because I said that I was running, I turned around and click.
Right. But that probably was not the case.
Of course not. That was a few years later, once I became a U.S. citizen, actually.
And, you know, we're smiling now, and often in life the difficult things look back fondly, but it certainly was a very difficult time.
Oh, of course, okay. But it was an exciting time, I tell you. It was difficult, but I had a dream. I mean, I knew that if you work hard, if you have a dream, if you have that fire in your belly, and if you keep pushing forward, better times will come. And I tell you, right before I came to this show, I got an email from a young person asking me, how can I do it? And I get those emails every day, dozens, hundreds of emails.
So what's the key?
And I tried, and I think the key is, to some extent, is you got to keep that desire. You can't let other people tell you, one, you cannot do it. You cannot stop believing in yourself, and you got to keep moving forward all the time and have that vision that if you keep working hard, this country is a wonderful country. This country still is very passionate about people who are passionate about what they do. And this country pays back. If you work hard, if you go to school, if you study, better times will come. And, you know, I am the same kid that I was 20 years ago.
I can see you look similar,
kid that I was, the same head, you know, nothing has changed much. You know, even though when I first came to the United States, I know you have a picture of my first mansion. This is what I call my first mansion.
We're going to see that shortly.
You know, we're going to see that in a few minutes. I mean, those were wonderful times, Ogan. It was just unbelievable, actually.
Well, we're going to go to a break. Let's talk in practical terms, especially since a lot of people write to you, a lot of kids write to you, or young people. Let's talk in practical terms how that sequence occurred right after the break.
Thank you.
You're watching Eye on Harvard. Our guest, good friend of mine, Dr. Alfredo Quinn Jonas. Stay right there. We'll be right back.
It's easy to tell if you've had way too many. But what if you've had just one too many? Buzz driving is drunk driving.
Hey guys, thanks for coming.
Are we in trouble?
No, you're not in trouble. I just want to set some ground rules.
Like what?
Well, remember last week when you hit Vinny in the head with the shovel?
I do not recall that.
Of course not. Well, it was pretty graphic. Too graphic for the kids. So I'm going to have to block you.
You know, I got to make this up to you. This is Vinny's watch, and I want you to have it. You deserve it.
Thank you. That's really not necessary.
No. Come here.
Welcome back. You're watching Eye on Harvard. Our guest, Dr. Alfredo Quinn Jonas, who's Associate Professor of Neurosurgery and Oncology at Johns Hopkins University, and with all due respect, of course, former migrant farm worker.
That's correct.
So let's...
Proud of it.
Well, it's hard work, and as you mentioned, it was out of necessity, and it helped your family.
And it's
There's nothing,
respectable work,
yeah,
okay? And
exactly.
it's respectable work. And that's what I tell, a lot of my students in the laboratory right now, my postdocs, is that one of the things that to me is essential in order to be successful in this country, in order to succeed in whatever we do, is that we have to take pride in anything we do. Or anywhere from the most menial job that we may conceive, as people may think that working in the fields may be considered menial. For me, it was a wonderful experience, and I took pride every day on what I do. It was the same hands that I used to pick tomatoes are the same hands that now, tender and caress the brain as I do brain surgery, but I did it with the same amount of passion and the same amount of dedication.
I think that's an excellent point, because you can't just turn on, for example, compassion.
That's correct.
You can't just turn on excellence like, well, I'm going to really try my darndest to be a neurosurgeon, and then when I become a neurosurgeon, I'm going to be really coordinated and excellent.
That's correct.
That's not the way it works.
That's exactly right.
Now, we have a picture of your first mansion.
My first mansion.
As you put it. So I'm not trying to be pejorative here, but you put it that way. That's your first mansion.
That's correct.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that was a wonderful house, actually.
6,000 square foot house.
That's correct. That was a wonderful house. This is where I lived when I first came to the United States, and you can actually see the beautiful fields in the background. This is the San Joaquin Valley, which is one of the biggest valleys, the farm labor valleys, and a lot of immigrants that come from Mexico, in the world, actually. And I live in that beautiful house. I mean, for me, it was good times and hard times. As you can see, I fixed that door. There was no door, and I had to fix that. I had to fix the ceiling, because the first night when it started raining, I woke up and I was completely drenched in water. And but it was a place to live. I had a ceiling, and I was very proud of being there, actually, at the time. And I always think about the wonderful experiences, the moments that I had there alone, thinking about my future. I'm to be honest with you. And I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, if I told you that it was all wonderful, I would be lying through my teeth. There were good times and there were hard times. I cried in that little house sometimes and thinking, what am I doing here? This is much more difficult than they portrayed on the movies. People always say the rags to riches. They think that things just happen immediately.
Well, let's go into that, actually, and I think that's an important point. Horatio Alger, rags to riches, however you want to phrase it, it's often made into Hollywood and looks easy, and obviously for a 2-hour movie you have to make it fit into that. What were the steps in practical terms, again, it's probably not planned out, in your life that, as succinct as possible?
That's correct. Well, the first thing, and what I tell everybody, is you have to come in and immerse yourself in the culture. You have to try to become part of the culture. And the first step that I took is to try to learn English. And I would be actually working in the fields. I remember from pulling weeds, I began to ascend the ladder to driving tractors, to driving cotton pickers and tomato pickers. And I would carry a small dictionary in my pocket all the time. And that's how I actually began to learn English, literally from a dictionary. So the first step that I took was learning English. Then I reached the point where I knew that I had reached my limit as a migrant farm worker, and I moved at this time to Stockton, California, which is a small town up in Northern California. Attended community college. Access to education is very important. California we're blessed, at least when I was there, that we have those community colleges where you can come in and learn English. But I had to become a permanent resident first. So I was lucky enough that I came through the immigration reform of California, a similar sort of addendum to migrant farm workers that allow me to be a temporary resident, then a permanent resident. And that's how I gained access to very basic but necessary education, where I began to take English as a second language, as well as my transfer core curriculum, working at night, going to school in the morning, working on the weekends.
So you're still working in the farms, it sounds like in more supervisory roles?
Well, at this point, I sort of graduated from the farms. I came to a small town in Stockton and began to literally work as a janitor in a railroad company. And these janitorial jobs include all the way from cleaning fish lard from these big tanks, railroad tanks, as well as, shoveling sulfur, every single type of manual dexterity or manual labor that you can imagine. And at the same time, I began to learn how to weld. And I became a board-certified welder in California around that time, actually. And then at night, I would go to community college, and then I became a supervisor in this welding company at night, and then I would attend the school in the morning. So it was a constant excitement for my life, and I kept just moving forward.
As you said in the beginning, you always have to be moving forward. I think we have a picture of you as a welder.
Is that right? Yeah,
let's show that.
Let's see what we have right here. That was it. This was 1988, around 1988 actually. So I was just about 20 years old right there. You can see, I'm actually up there in a railroad car, and this is what I was doing. I was actually welding those, and I was painting those. I became a painter as well. Just these big tanks, I was actually a painter. So to some extent, I was already expressing my artistic side, which is not much different than what I do today.
Yeah.
What I do today, Ogan, as you know, and what you did it yourself as brain surgeons, I think is wonderful. But the stakes are much higher, obviously, because we have humans' lives in our hands. But the same discipline that I used back then as a welder, the same pride that I took in making sure that every job I did was excellent and the best I could possibly do, is the same principles that I use today in the operating room.
Well, I was just thinking, when you're welding, you're doing the actual surgical goal, if you will.
That's right.
And then when you're painting, you're closing. And the two are connected. You can't just paint to cover up something that wasn't done right. And at the same rate, if the welding is not done right, and again, I haven't done welding, but I would imagine that the paint job is more hard.
I never thought about it this way, but that is a wonderful way to think about it. That's absolutely right.
And I think it harks back to what you said. Everything has to be done with passion and excellence.
Absolutely.
Well, we're going to take a break. We'll talk some more about the progression from migrant worker to neurosurgeon, Dr. Alfredo Quinn Jonas, and the article was Terra Firma. Maybe you could tell us also after the break how that name came out.
Good.
Stay right there. We'll be right back. Thank you.
Any questions? No. You know. We're not magicians. We can't read your mind.
We need your questions, each and every kind.
What are the side effects, doctor?
How many times have you done this before?
Will this react with my other medicine? Hey, what are all these tests even for?
Welcome back. You're watching Eye on Harvard, brought to you by In Time TV. Our guest is Dr. Alfredo Quinn Jonas, a good friend of mine, and actually I haven't seen him in a while, but great to see you, obviously. And we're talking about his remarkable career, progressing from obviously a little child in the lap of his mother. We saw the picture of that. And everybody starts out that way, of course. But uniquely in your situation, as we talked about, migrant farm worker to neurosurgeon. And there's an article in the New England Journal that you wrote entitled Terra Firma. And tell us what that is in reference to.
Well, Ogan, in April 14th, 1989, I had an event that truly changed my life, in ways that I am beginning to understand now as I get older, what could have happened. And as I get older, I try to understand also my past to try to see if I can be a better person in my future. I was working on the railroad, and I fell in a tank, one of those very, very large tanks that carry liquefied petroleum gas. And I almost pulled myself out of it. I literally, one of my coworkers threw a rope down, and I was able to lift myself up at about 17 feet, the height of this ceiling, more or less.
So you were obviously submerged.
Well, this was empty, but there was no oxygen because there's only a small opening. At the time, I was working as a valve specialist, so I was fixing the valves because these are pressurized tanks. So you take the valves from the top, and there's an opening that is probably about 18 inches, and through that I went down. There's no light, there's no oxygen, and I remember as I fell down. You know, I can go into details.
17 feet is a long distance.
It's a long distance, and I was young, and I fell down, and as soon as I fell down, I realized there was no oxygen. And I remember looking up, and I see a small hole where I can see the light, that light at the end of the tunnel that we all talked about.
Wow.
And my coworker threw this rope, and as he threw the rope down, I was able to pull myself all the way up, and I remember grabbing my coworker's hand, you know, very, very strongly, and he thought, this is it, we're gonna get him out of here. And right around that time, I remember I saw him asking once for help, very vividly. The second time I saw him,
so you were blacking out.
I was blacking out already. The second time, now that I understand how the brain, especially the part of the back of the brain, the occipital cortex, processes information, the second time I saw him asking for help, and I saw 4 frames. And the third time, I just saw one blur and no sound. And that was it. And this time, I went down the second time, completely unconscious, and I landed on the floor. By a miracle, I made it out of there alive.
So you fell back down?
I fell back down the second time.
How did they get you out?
Well, believe it or not, my father was a co-worker there. Luckily, they didn't let him in because he wanted to. Otherwise, probably the two of us wouldn't have made it out of there. But my brother-in-law saved my life, Ramon. He was probably the only person who could have done it. He was thin enough and strong enough and young enough that he could go down. He went down twice also. The first time they brought him out almost unconscious, and went down a second time and put a rope. It was out of a movie, actually. So they pulled me out of there, a miracle, and I woke up in the hospital. And I never forget this. I woke up in the hospital, and the first thing that I see is my father. My first recollection now, as I tell me, my father on the right side, and this person dressed in white on my left side. That was a physician who was taking care of me. And I felt so secure. I knew that everything was right. I didn't know exactly what happened, but I knew things weren't right because I had lies about me, a lot of people asking me, undressing me and stuff like that, and checking me, examining, and I had this person in white. And I felt that I was in such a great care in what we call terra firma, and solid ground at this
terra
point.
Firma, yes.
Exactly, and this is exactly how the name of that essay came about for the New England Journal of Medicine. And I think about what we do as physicians every day, and we provide that sort of care, our responsibility, our sort of desires to make sure that our patients do well. And I feel so secure at that point with that physician taking care of me.
Because I guess one cannot completely eliminate all the falls, the trips and turns and twists of life.
Exactly.
But on one level, even if you're obviously an adult and independent, there's a certain level ultimately when your health is down,
that's right,
or you're injured, that there's a support under that, and that's provided by physicians.
That's correct.
And the healthcare system.
In my opinion, yes. I mean, I am obviously biased for what I do, but I have passion and I love what I do, and I think that we as physicians have an incredible responsibility, and we also have an incredible desire to help our fellow human beings.
So this leads to another interesting question. Was that the time when you decided to become a physician?
I don't think so.
I don't remember you saying that.
I don't think so. I don't know. It was chance that led me to become a physician. Looking back, as when I was at Berkeley, I went on from community college to UC Berkeley before going on to Harvard. And I remember being at UC Berkeley and thinking, what am I going to do next? And it took a trip back to Mexico for my maternal grandfather, who was dying in 1993, to realize what my paternal grandmother had done as a curandera, as a healer in our small little town, you know, someone who had an incredible amount of influence in other humans, as someone who knew very little about medicine, but she knew about herbs, she knew about how to deliver babies, and she helped a lot of people in the old ways. So I felt that that may actually potentially be what I wanted to do in my last year at UC Berkeley as I began to look into medical school. It was faith more than anything, because I didn't have any role models, no physicians, no friends, no one to look up to.
But the role of a physician is not necessarily, you know, totally an MD certified, etc. I mean, as you mentioned, your paternal grandmother was.
That's correct.
Had that role, if you will, which encompasses the humanity, the caring.
That's correct.
And certainly a certain level of expertise, albeit in a different realm. And speaking of expertise, right now you're one of the world's experts on stem cells applied to neuro-oncology. Actually, Alfredo's here at the AANS, the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, and we'll be talking about that. And in fact, he'll be on our Insights in Medicine show in the next hour, so basically in a few minutes, talking about stem cells in neuro-oncology. And certainly you're welcome to join us for that, and looking forward to that discussion.
I am very excited about it, Ogan. Thank you.
Well, thanks for sharing your remarkable story with us. You can read about it in the New England Journal of Medicine, and we'll see a lot more successes. I'm sure of that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Ogan.
so
Wonderful.
much.
Thank you.
And we'll see you in a few moments.
Absolutely. Delighted.
Thank you very much. You're watching Eye on Harvard. Our next guest next week will be the Chief Scientific Officer of Baxter Scientific. Stay right there. We'll see you next week. Thank you.